From the management team point of view in terms of this particular meeting, really what we want to come out of this session is a set of recommendations to us in terms of what are the next steps. How do we try and capture not alone what we heard today, but also some of the very good suggestions that we had in terms of approaches and in terms of protocols that might be followed. So I've just put together a couple of slides, one of them on the whole question of restoration and the stock rebuilding, if you like, in terms of the wild stocks. So just click on to the second one for me for a moment. I don't have a clicker. The second one then is the whole question of stocking for catch. So if we can separate the two things out, I know it's a bit artificial. Go back to the first one again, if we may, and just look initially then at the wild stocks. Thank you very much, Hannah. We have several people in the room who've already approached me who'd like to say some bits and pieces, very important bits and pieces in relation to this, but I thought this might just help us as a sort of checklist. You can ignore it if you like, you can add anything you like, it's your discussion, but I want to ask if everybody is agreed, and it might be a trite question to ask, but are we agreed of the primacy of wild stocks? They are the main thing. The conservation and protection of those, that's our main aim. Secondly, that the stocks under pressure who are consistently below their conservation limit, they're the stocks that we want to try and concentrate on in terms of looking at the wild stocks. In terms of an approach, I thought John Gibbs' decision structure. John, was that from the original NASCO decision structure? I thought I recognised some boxes that I'd put in on it. So I'd forgotten about that, and it's actually a very useful tool. I think it needs to be revisited, but I think it's a very good approach. In terms then of assessment and guidance, who do you go to? Graham's point. Who do you actually turn to actually give you that checklist and bring you through the checklist before you even stock? How do you actually get guidance in relation to that? And the whole question then of restoration advice and support. We heard from Stephen in relation to the physical restoration. We've heard lots of suggestions in terms of the good example perhaps even that Jim gave us from Northern Ireland in terms of this restoration question. And we heard some very innovative stuff from John yesterday in terms of the work that Ian Fleming is doing. So what are the gaps here in research terms? So I think we've three bits really that we need to try and focus in on. Number one is the preliminary assessment. How do we guide people in relation to that preliminary assessment? If they do decide to stock, and this I think is where maybe Andy Ferguson might be able to help us out in terms of a chat we had this morning in relation to some existing documentation. So if you do decide to stock, what do you do? What are the steps that you should do to make absolutely certain that you're actually addressing the problem and that you're not going to damage anything? And thirdly, if there are bits we don't know, what's the research we want to prioritise? What are the real pieces we want to pull up to the top of the pile? And the question then of the climate change issues, not just what we're facing at the moment, should this be highlighted in the context of the whole question of research, what we're facing into? And some of the examples then that Tom gave us earlier in terms of the Rescale project that we did in Burrishoole, where we've looked now at the actual impacts on the salmonids up to 2090. And by 2050, 2060, you're looking at a very changed regime. Should we be planning now? And is hatcheries something we should be including in those plans? And in terms of the aims and the objectives of those particular components, where do we get guidance on that? Where do we get some ideas as to how we do that? And who actually should prioritise these aims and objectives? Is it the person on the ground? Is it the organisation? Is it something we leave up to just general debate in the catchments? And who exactly should fund these particular areas? For example, who should fund the research? Are we looking at a situation where we're looking at the funding of research coming more from owners, from anglers, from the private sector? We're in times where funding is really very difficult from a state point of view, and if we're looking for the state to fund any of these aspects, including giving us documentation or web-based advice in relation to guidance, we really need to be able to make a very, very good case. So they're just some thoughts that I had, and perhaps we might start with that question of the preliminaries. Has anybody got in their back pocket a nice little document that they can refer us to that actually tells us the steps by which we can go through the preliminaries to see whether or not we need to stock? Ted?
I think that I'm concerned that you're going too quickly to stocking. The emphasis, and Katie picked this up this morning, the emphasis has to be on identifying what the problem is. This is where David started us off on the first day. Salmon have an amazing ability to restore themselves if you remove the problems. The only reason you can catch salmon and not decimate a population is because they produce an excess. That excess, if it's there and can and is not being constrained by the carrying capacity of the system, will restore the population up to the new carrying capacity. So if you remove an impact, you effectively raise the carrying capacity, and the stock will restore itself very quickly. The reason we can't, we're in the position where stocks aren't restoring themselves is because those impacts are still there. So the key is actually identifying those impacts. If you can't remove an impact, and climate change is just an example of something you can't remove, then you might start thinking about going down the stocking route. And in those cases, you're almost certainly thinking about a long-term commitment, because you're trying to mitigate for something you can't remove. I mean, John's example here was one where perhaps he hopes that the problem will be removed before too long, but even then, I think you were committed to the fact that this was trying to just keep the boat afloat in the short term. But I really do feel we're not giving enough credit to the ability of the fish to restore itself if you get rid of the problems. And I think there has to be a huge emphasis on go out there, remove the problems, and you won't then have to be spending more and more money every year.
Thanks, Ted, but I think that was the point I was trying to make. I probably made it very badly. In terms of the preliminaries, I want to know, do we clone Ted Potter? How does Graham get access to you or to someone else to bring them? No, that's the very point. I think people are going to the hatchery option because they're not being brought through exactly what you have outlined. Now, I'm asking the audience now, is that true? Is that what's lacking? Do people not go through this sequence or just suddenly jump at hatcheries? Or what's the missing component here? Why is it that Jim's anglers are looking towards hatcheries immediately rather than going through the logical process that we talked about yesterday and you've now outlined?
Can I?
Ted, I'll let you come back and then I'll go to Eric.
Well, I mean, the answer I would say is merely because it's the easy option. I mean, you're immediately seeing fish, and everybody thinks if you're putting fish in, you must get fish back. But in reality, if the population is constrained by carrying, I mean, the concept people don't get in their heads is if the population is actually being constrained by an impediment of some sort, an impact of some sort, then it doesn't matter how many fish you stick in. You have a glass ceiling, or probably not a glass ceiling. So that's the message that's not getting across. It just looks like the easy option, and it's true. It is the easy option. You see all the things that Stephen was talking about. There was a hell of a lot of work that went on in there to address the impacts. But the long-term solution has to be prioritizing those impacts, and that's not an easy job. And then ticking them off as Stephen has.
Okay, Eric.
Yeah,
And then Steve.
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. One of the key things I think that's missing is actual documentation of the rationale that underlies any particular management strategy or approach that's taken. So that we often have selective memories. We say we did things for certain reasons, and what I think is very clearly required is a statement of the available evidence. It needs to be documented, it needs to be set down, it needs to be in the public domain so that everybody can see what information is available that relates to the decision about taking a particular management action or a management approach. That then allows you to identify what your step is, be it stocking, be it habitat improvement, and then to go back, look at what evidence you had, see whether it has made a difference or not. And I think the number of stocking programs where you actually have an adequate documentation about the rationale for actually going to stocking, where it's clearly stated what evidence you based it upon as opposed to a gut feeling, is extremely limited. And I think that would be an important first step that would help us see where we were, where we're going.
Thank you, Eric. Steve, yeah, can you help us? Is there something in North America that we can dust off?
Well, I don't know. But I do have a question to your point. So I've got 2 points to make, and the second one is addressing your question about communication, because there may be a misunderstanding across the ocean here. I agree with what Ted was saying. Ted was focusing on looking at the impacts, and I was going to the point where what Eric just said, so I'll say it maybe just a little bit differently, and that is, if you're going to consider actions, I think you need a baseline, a before data set, because I think I worry too much, even in the United States, that actions are requested from an angler's perspective on catch. And I think we all know that while catch is a helpful metric that we can track, it's not necessarily an accurate assessment of a population. And so in order to find out, before you propose stocking or perhaps other things, you need to go in and do a fairly rigorous assessment of what's in there now, both quantity and quality, before you, and then identify the impacts, as Ted was saying. So, Eric and I are probably saying about the same thing. But my second question, Ken, you're asking, where do you go for this information? How does one begin? And my question relates to, in over here, who has the statutory authority? In the U.S., it is the states, and you can't operate a hatchery, you can't build a fishway, you can't do any of these things without the state's permission. And so if somebody has these ideas, they have to come to our agency and they have to consult with us. And so for me to, if you ask that question in the United States, my answer would be very simple. You come to me. You talk to me and my staff, and we'll consult with you and we'll try to figure this out together. So I throw the question back to you. Is it different here? Is that not the case? Can people undertake these actions without consulting government workers?
Officially, no. In reality, yes.
Well done.
My question is answered.
I'm just going to take it in sequence now.
Okay, well,
yes,
Ken, we live in
Stephen.
a world where the default solution is a hatchery.
Yeah.
And as we know, hatcheries always work until somebody monitors them. And very often they don't get monitored at all. The problem we have as a group is to persuade people to look beyond that. And if every river had a walkover survey, as we have on our two, which contained the details of all barriers, erosions, shaded, fenced, the whole lot, and then someone was able to explain what this all means to the angling community, and the best thing that could ever happen at all is to ban hatcheries, because then they would actually have to go out there and do something positive that we know works. Unfortunately,
Okay, I'll
Jamie.
give it to Jamie then. Yep, and to Paul.
As someone who started working in the world of salmon and trout biology in 2000, I'm conscious I'm something of a newcomer to the field. I previously worked on blowflies and small African parasites. Not many people care about those things, and I think one of the nice things about working on salmon and trout is that despite the differences of opinion in this room, people care, people really care, and as a community, we should build on that. And I think one of the things about stocking is I suspect it's a frustration born out of people who want to do something because they care. And I think Stephen's example on the Waianask, and I see it with colleagues at the West Country Rivers Trust, once people can be shown other ways that they can do something, the pressures of some of those other, let's have a hatchery, some of that disappears. And I think, whether you want to call it education or awareness, I think that's a key factor in channeling that effort and that amount of caring by people.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to make a proposal, really. When catch and release was the big issue 4 or 5 years ago, quite a lot of us NGOs, including AST ourselves, got together and produced a pamphlet, which has just been reproduced for the Waianask. Why isn't one of the outcomes of this meeting that we produce a very simple pamphlet, which can be both written and on websites, that actually starts, putting out this decision process, and the outcomes of this meeting, and where you need to go to, and where hatcheries may or may not fit in that. I think that would be a really good outcome.
Okay. Can I suspend things for one moment? Kyle, could be a good point for you to show us your list of 7. Kyle might have a suggestion in that regard.
It's not my list, but there should be a folder titled Afternoon Discussion on that computer. And in there, these are not my 7 points. I will spare you those. I have 37. But these 7 points come from a similar conference.
But I think that's an excellent idea. I'm looking for Sean. Is Sean Leonard still here? Sean, and building on your fantastic section in your website, I think people should be reading that. And I know it's in relation to trout, but the ingredients are all there. So I think we're getting close. Yeah, I know that. I know that. But once the chairman has given you permission, you see you can do anything. You know, that's the way this show works.
I would, incidentally, I would go one further than a pamphlet on a website. I think a 2-page article for salmon and trout and a 2-page article for Journey Fisheries Biology or FME. I think it needs to be more than a pamphlet on a website. Have you located that? I would also recommend, we were talking about finding areas that don't have the fry densities you think they should and stocking those. And my recommendation to fisheries managers and angling clubs who are thinking of doing that, a much cheaper, less destructive, and more fun day out, go to the nearest area with lots of spawning, get a garbage can, throw a bucket of ice in the bottom, fill it halfway up with water, get a pack, shock up 1,000 fry on day 1, take them up and put them in, go back 2 days later, shock up another 1,000 fry, take them up, dump them in. Fry don't move more than a few hundred meters before they die, and anywhere there's high spawning density, 90% of them are going to be dead in a month. So all you're doing is moving a very small fraction of the doomed majority into open fry habitat, and you're changing your intervention from tens of thousands of pounds and months and months and months to 2 hours and a pint. And letting, you're literally, that interference is hours. So this was put out. Can you go back one slide, please? Some of you were probably at this conference, which I presume happened in 2011 or perhaps 2010. And this is what they came up with. I would change some of the wording, but this is a reasonable starting point, I believe.
Do you want to just bring us quickly through it to save some time?
Well, I've never actually read it.
Yeah.
Well, one is the first point we said, releases should not be performed in wild salmon rivers with viable populations. And I think the word viable is critical. That means immediate risk of extirpation. To correct the extinction vortex, species go extinct, populations are extirpated. So we're actually talking about extirpation vortices today. And that's not done. That doesn't mean a conservation limit of 5,000 and a return of 4,000. That means population viability analysis, 50 individuals. So if your conservation limit is 4,000 and you have 3,000 fish coming back, that is a viable, healthy salmon population. And that's critical to understand. Fin clipping, obvious. Do the conservation genetics, obvious. Monitor what you're doing, obvious. Always more research. I'd be a fool to say otherwise. What else do we have? Need for conservation actions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And someone just mentioned conservation action plans. Walk every meter of anadromous water on your catchment.
So basically, we're coming back to that list again. Go and let you come in now.
I just want to
I know you've been very patient. Okay, John.
Can I reverse that? And walking every single metre of your catchment is stage 1. Yeah. Because once you've done that, you will be shocked, you'll be amazed, you'll see so many problems, you will completely refocus on sorting out the problems, because they are everywhere and they're solvable.
Yep. John.
And if you can't solve the problems, then go to the hatchery.
I can't let this one go, I'm afraid. Whoever drew up that list has never worked on a river with 17 fish farms in the estuary and any knowledge of Scottish government politics whatsoever. So please let's not adopt number 1 on that list because I might as well pack up shop and leave the river to its fate. But what I was going to say, just very briefly, in Scotland, and since we're sitting here in Glasgow, any stocking that takes place has to be authorised by a district salmon fishery board. And the district salmon fishery boards in Scotland have an excellent document already that all permissions have to pass through. And it's a flow chart, just as I showed in my presentation. So already these documents do exist. RAFTs also have one. So I don't think it would take much to synthesise all the documents that are out there into one very clear document that every single stocking application should go through, and that can be explained to anglers, be it through Trout and Salmon magazine or just in day-to-day local discussions. And so we're all singing from the same hymn book, and I think it'd be a pretty easy thing to do. But anyway, thank you.
Okay, well certainly let's not lose this, because the same thing happened at the Flows conference a few years ago. We unearthed a massive amount of grey literature that was really important. And then we had asked at the conference afterwards for people to contact us and tell us where all this material they talked about existed, and we got no real email. So can I ask people to contact me and just give me just the reference to the existing document, and we'd be delighted to do, as Paul has suggested, try and coalesce that and see can we come up with the magic list of 10 or 12 actions that people take in advance of deciding what they want to do in terms of their stock rebuilding programme. And I take Ted's point, we should call it in advance of their stock rebuilding programme, maybe instead of in advance of their stocking programme. Yeah.
Could I just say, if that gentleman could come and help us electrofish, if he can get 1,000 fry in that amount of time, we could do with a hand.
4 hours.
Our experience in the Carron, we kind of followed all that protocol, because when we looked for wild fish, first of all, by the rod, we were catching about 5 or 6 farm fish for every wild fish we caught, and I think we only caught about 4 wild fish. We then did walk the river at this time of year, very low water. It's not difficult, it's a very clear river. And I can remember identifying about 2 or 3 pairs and going back to collect them one way or another, and finding that one pair had been eaten by an otter, and that left us just 2 pairs to collect. When you're down at that level and you say, well, identify the problems are we don't have any adult fish. We have a very mobile river that has completely changed course. There doesn't appear to be any juveniles. And we have a slightly hostile, at different times, environment in the inner loch. So all we've done, and the only thing that we felt that we could do at that stage, was have a smolt run from fish that we felt were Carron genetic fish. And that's where we've started. Our expectations have been exceeded, which is why I said yesterday we expected to get 30 adult fish back, but we're now averaging over 300. So that raises the question for us, right, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? And are we now, and having listened to everything that I've listened to for the last 2 days, I think we've done everything wrong, from what I've heard for the last 2 days, but we must have done something right. And now we're investigating it to see that possibly in the future we're not of a mind to continue stocking forever. In fact, we think it would be a good thing if we did stop stocking, but we wouldn't learn anything until we had a hostile environment to make comparisons, until we had a hostile environment in the sea loch, or we had another catastrophic flood, and then we'd begin to learn more about the work that we've done and the success that we've had. And time will tell whether what we've been doing will affect the fitness. Unfortunately now, because we're doing the keep net system we do with adult fish coming back, will allow us to do a lot more analysis of that.
Well, I think that was the very point I made to Eric when I asked that we'd have a presentation from the Carron, was that you've now made the sensible decision to assess what you've done. And I think for many people who with very good intentions have put hatchery systems in place in the past, that hasn't been the case. And then suddenly people are either convinced that their hatchery program was a complete failure or a complete success, and they've no data on which to base it. So at least we're giving guidance now that people should look to test what they've done. I think that's important. If you might, Eric, just for one moment, I'll let you come in. Yeah.
David Clark from the Lochs Agency. I'd just like to comment on Roger's talk. I think it summed up very, very well the other influences to do with hatcheries that have nothing to do with fish, the political things, the socioeconomic things. And I think one of the major issues with hatcheries are absolutely brilliant at managing the public's perception. They are absolutely fantastic at making anglers think that things are being done they're seen as a quick fix, and whether it's fish or it's climate change or whatever, people want a quick fix. And I think unless you address the perception and the attitude, they'll always, I mean, there's not even agreement in this room as to whether hatcheries and stocking are a good thing or a bad thing, never mind the general public. So I think addressing the attitudes and the perceptions is really the main thing, and using easily accessed media, TV programs like Country File, the angling press, things like that. I think that's the way to get the messages out there.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Eric, do you want to make a point?
Yeah, first thing is there's enough stocking manuals out there. They've been there for years. People just don't look at what they actually mean in terms of implementing the general guidance on their specific rivers. There's need for help in translating that and what it means in the river. The other thing is we tend to judge whether a river is under its capacity by looking at the 1950s and 60s and saying, hey, we don't have as many salmon in the river as there were then. There should be, there's something wrong, let's stock. I think what's certainly where we need more educational material, and I'm very disappointed that some of the studies that Ronald Campbell and Dave Summers have done on the historical abundance levels, which demonstrate that the 50s and 60s are very anomalous. They're the peak abundances that we've seen in the last 200 years in rivers which are otherwise very healthy rivers. We need to find a way of defining what a healthy river is, what is a normal range of abundance in a river, so that we can make a decision whether in fact we should be intervening at all. Because any fish farmer will tell you, if you put too many fish into a tank, it becomes counterproductive. So there is an optimal level, and nature finds that optimal level. What we need to know is whether a river is in a state where there is a problem or not. And certainly in a case of a river like the Spey, I think that's a very important thing to establish. You know, is there scope for more production from that river at all? And that could be said for most rivers.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Can I be really controversial in terms of what we've heard so far? It strikes me that the main reason for putting hatcheries in place is so that we can catch more fish. I mean, you know, I know, is that the case? Are people doing the hatchery thing because they want to protect the stocks? I think there's two completely contrasting views of life here. I think there are people sitting in the room here that really genuinely believe that people who undertake these sort of programs, in terms of Stephen's program, in terms of hatchery programs and so on, they're doing it for the good of the fish. And then there are other people who very clearly are very straightforward and saying we're doing it because we want to catch more fish. So if people are doing it to catch more fish, then we need to address that upfront in the very start of any document that we're recommending to people, because I think that is a very different objective to the objective we're talking about, because most of the biologists and geneticists in this room, I'd guess, are basically saying if you have a surplus and that surplus is harvestable, yes, the anglers and the netsmen can get it. That's an entirely different scenario to the scenario that most guys, in my experience, that are putting up hatcheries are thinking of. They're thinking, I'll put in my 100,000 fry, and as Roger showed us, they will make the assumption that they're going to catch more fish. And any comments on that in terms of whether we're talking about the same thing or not? Kyle?
I think that's an important point, and it is my impression, and it was my impression in 1997 when I started my PhD, that there is a clear, logical, evidence-based scientific consensus that stocking damages wild populations. That evidence base has become gloriously, in the last 10 years. But that figure I showed the other day of the stock recruitment curves, that was from 1997. So the issue is a disconnect between the evidence-based scientific consensus and management. And even acknowledging that would be a success, if that can be our first statement.
Steve?
In answer to your question, I know we're in Scotland and we're really talking about these rivers here, but in answer to your question, I think that, you know, in North America, in the southern part of the range, there's no catch at all, and so these hatcheries are being operated at, we now term them as conservation hatcheries, both in the U.S. and I suspect a bit in Canada as well, and even perhaps in the southern part of the range in Europe, that whether they call it that or not, there's conservation hatcheries going on. So yeah, it's good to distinguish those two efforts, but I think your effort is to call it what it is, and I think you're right. Up here, I get a sense that a lot of these hatcheries are so people can catch more fish.
Okay.
Which is fine.
Sorry, yeah, Ivor first. We'll go back to you then, Paul. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think in answer to your question, Ken, the great majority probably don't see that as a question. They don't see it as different things. Their hatchery is there to improve the stock of fish and so they can catch more fish. And I think one of the first things is actually to demonstrate to people that there are two issues here. One is about the conservation of natural stocks, and the other is about catching more fish. They're not necessarily the same. In many cases they are, but they're not invariably. And I think it really follows from that the publication that Paul's talking about does need to focus on the point that was made over there, that the key thing is to educate people on the realities. There's a lot of material about stocking if you want to look at that, but people are not clear about why, what the problem is, whether you actually need to stock, whether there will be natural regeneration. And I think perhaps we need to time the publication of whatever we produce with the web tool you were talking about earlier, so that people, when they're reading about what the options are, can also look at something which will actually show them the powers of natural regeneration and how many eggs a fish will produce. And indeed, whether it makes sense to take 70 fish out and then to put them through an expensive hatchery in order to put the fry in, or whether it makes much more sense to let the 70 fish get on with it. I suspect in many cases the answer is going to be pretty obvious.
Okay, I'll take Ted first. I know you were next, but Ted has the mic. So.
Thank you.
And then Paul next, sorry.
It's just, I think in many cases, they're actually the same thing. If you restore your population, and particularly if you restore it to above what we call the conservation limit, then what you're doing is providing the maximum sustainable yield. You're actually maximizing your potential to exploit that population. The situation where they're not the same is actually when you start stocking against a background of artificially enhancing the population above what it can achieve, and in which case it's a short-term fix, and it's effectively a ranching exercise.
Absolutely.
But in any other situation, there's just two ways of looking at the same thing. You improve your population, you have a stable population. A stable population around conservation limit is actually the maximally exploitable status. So I don't know whether it's actually helpful to make people understand that they're actually talking about the same thing, and that they would be better off. I mean, I think this is the problem we have a lot of the time, that it's back to this thing of stocking is a short-term fix to provide fish on the rod to some people, but actually the sustainable approach is trying to fix the problems and ensure you have a population that can do it for itself.
Okay, I go to one second, if I may, just to give you an example, because Ronald Campbell sent it to me, knowing this question would come up. Ronald couldn't make it, and he apologises. I think from memory, I think he said the biggest peak run they had on the Tweed was 23,000, and he had a letter. Where's Johannes? He had a letter then from a guy saying that with 23,000 and a proper Ranga operation, they could have doubled the amount of fish that were available to anglers. I'm afraid, Ted, that's the mindset that we're dealing with. The majority, and I'll put my hands up, I'm an angler, the majority of anglers want consistency and they want to catch lots of fish. And any system that can be put in place that will provide them with a Ranga, they're very keen on doing it. And a lot of the stuff we talked about, in my experience over the last 2 days, goes over their heads because their focus is on catching more fish. That would be my view of life. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, well, a couple of points. I think on that, I think this takes a bit of leadership, and I think one or two of us in the room have been trying to do that over the years, and I think that the great thing that anglers are beginning to realise is that they are beginning to go into more mainstream environmental and conservation terms, that angling is a sort of a dividend that comes along behind that. And I think that's the place that angling should look to in the modern environment. Otherwise, you know, we're going to turn public opinion against us. But going back to what Ivor said, I agree entirely. I don't want all the literature that's out there, thank you very much. You know, it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is very simply put. Starts off with David's, was it 4 or 5, you know, ideas, very succinctly put, and just a 4-pager that then can direct people to websites that you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into as far as you need. But what we don't need is the scientific stuff, which, as you say, goes over people's heads. We want something that simply says, you don't actually, or do you know what you're doing? And inferring you don't, and telling them why. Do you know what I mean? But being positive, and there are decisions to be made here, and actually a hatchery, as Ted said, I agree with entirely what Ted says. You've got to get a river, full production, it's what came out of La Rochelle, full production of healthy smolts, and then angling is a dividend that benefits from that.
Okay, well, if we could get agreement on that, I think that would be superb. Let me open it up. Yes, you've wanted to come in for a while, David.
Yeah. Changing the subject very slightly from where we've just been, am I the only person who claims to be a scientist here who is uneasy with the recommendation that Kyle made that the consensus of scientific opinion is that hatcheries damage stocks? Now, I don't have any axe to grind for hatcheries. I don't think they're relevant to most situations. For example, I agree on the spay. I suspect that there's nothing wrong with the spay other than low marine survival, and people are looking back to the golden days and comparing it with that. And that's nothing wrong with the spay. It's a problem elsewhere which you can't really deal with. But the evidence that hatcheries are actually damaging, there's some very convincing stuff from North America with another species. Where is the real evidence from the British Isles or the Northeast Atlantic area that Atlantic salmon stocks have been damaged by hatcheries routinely? Of course, if you do it wrong or you overdo it, you can do damage. But all we've had is a lot of hand-wringing, graphs without any dimensions and so on them, showing far from vortices, just descent of numbers. And I'm not convinced by it. I want more analysis, more information. The situations we've talked about, Delphi and Burrishoole, it could be that things are badly wrong there, and the stocks which are there now are compromised. But I would like to see more evidence. I'd be uneasy with a blanket suggestion these things are wrong and harmful.
Okay.
May I qualify my statement?
Yeah.
Viable populations. So if you do a population viability analysis, and if a population is at genuine risk of extirpation through demographic stochasticity, that's why we have our hatchery. If a population is large enough that it is not at risk of extirpation from demographic stochasticity, you are almost, by definition, reducing its population growth rate by putting mismatched phenotypes into it. Those are the first principles of population and evolutionary biology. Yes, data is slow to accumulate, and thank God for Oregon Fish and Wildlife, who have a full pedigree of 20 years. And when we have a full pedigree of 20 years from a similar system here with Atlantic salmon or sea trout, we will see the same thing. The numbers will be slightly different. If you measure gravity on the top of the mountain, it's a bit different than in a valley on the equator. They will both round out to 9.8.
Thanks. Eric, you were going to say something, and then Jim?
Yeah, I'm just going to say to David Solomon that his wish has been granted, actually. ICES has convened a working group on the evaluation of the effectiveness of salmon restoration efforts, which Dennis Ensing from Northern Ireland is chairing, and which is bringing a large group of scientists together to actually review all the information and see what it actually tells us about what works and what doesn't work. And I think probably if you canvassed scientists, you'd find a wide range of views on the issues, somewhere between David and Kyle in terms of a lot of these issues. It's science. We don't know everything out there. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of issues which are quite subtle.
Okay.
Can I very quickly respond? There is
Yeah.
a very major difference between things which are merely a waste of time and those which are damaging. I would defend the right of somebody to waste their time and money trying something which doesn't work, but I would not defend their right to do damage to stocks with the same program.
Okay. Jim? Oh, yeah. Where the clicker's gone.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a couple of observations. The first one is to beware sweeping generalizations. The generalizations that nearly all hatcheries are bad. It just doesn't fall well with me. The second generalization was that most anglers just want to catch fish. Now, this morning in Belfast, the government department responsible for most of Northern Ireland tabled a proposal for new regulations for next year so that there will be no killing of salmon next year in the greater part of Northern Ireland, no nets, and all angling catch and release, with one very small exception. But we have quite a number of angling clubs who have introduced catch and release 2, even 3 years ago, maybe longer, years ahead of the government department. So the generalisation that most anglers want to catch fish, times are changing, I think.
Good, well, that's what Paul was saying to us as well. That's great news. Yes?
Just in reply to David there, two things. First of all, the science, there really is a massive advances now. I think these full pedigrees, historical pedigrees, going back looking at historical material, retrieving pedigrees from archive scales and so on, and some of the index systems, I think that's going to be very informative over the next 5 or 6, 7 years. Now, it costs money, but some of the investment is going there. But I think I'd like to challenge David to whether it's dimensionless graphs or dimensionful graphs or whatever it is, to prove the corollary that there's no impact from the hatcheries. Maybe, to bring some scientific evidence to that effect would be very useful and very helpful to the debate. I think it's very easy. I'd wonder what you would have to do. The studies that I presented, which are empirical studies, 2 or 3 of them, very powerful studies, I think, Ken, you were very much in support of them at the start, 10, 12, 14 years to run. They're a difficult process. But there is empirical information that at least demonstrates the point. So I think I'd put the challenge back to Dave. Please come up with the evidence in as robust a form as possible that the corollary is the correct situation.
No, I cannot demonstrate that. I accept that absolutely.
Yes, but then you have to be accepting of, yes, no, but I wouldn't be so dismissive of the evidence that has been presented. I don't know, look, but maybe I don't know, but I would have thought there was a substantial amount of information, first, and evidence, second, that were brought to the table today from many speakers.
Thanks, Phil. Yes, you want to mention the T word again, Sean?
I am good.
All right, we'll give you permission.
And I will start by saying it is about trout, but my colleague Paul Gaskell has done a synthesis, a review of scientific literature and tried to turn it into a very simple summary document. He looked at, I think in total, over 600 scientific papers. He boiled them down to about 50 that were brown trout specific, and over 80% of those showed deleterious effects from stocking into native stocks of trout. So the literature is there.
Yes, sorry, you were trying to come in for a while there.
Is this I got the microphone.
It obviously is working.
I'll come to you next, Stephen, yeah.
So I'd just like to query something about the list that was up until a moment ago. Point 6 was saying, well, as Kyle's acknowledged, that there are circumstances with weak populations where stocking may be a viable conservation measure. Number 2 says a fin clipping should be mandatory. Now, as I understand it from what I've read before and from what I've heard over this conference, the method of stocking that poses the least risk in terms of deleterious impacts on the remaining wild population in terms of introducing domesticated phenotypes and so on is to stock as early as possible as unfed or very new or very, very young first feed fry. That doesn't go along with fin clipping being mandatory. I just wondered how you would sort of resolve that dilemma.
Well, that goes back to what we were told yesterday about Sweden. That's for the Baltic. So they don't have any fry. So it's all smoke, I think. Stephen?
Yeah, Ken, I'm going back to David again on what he said. And what he's implying is that if you just do nothing or spend your money unwisely on a river, that's okay, or it's acceptable. The trouble is, managing a salmon river is a whole catchment affair, and it needs to involve everybody. And what we've got is a group of people on some rivers who say hatchery, and another group saying maybe something else. And the trouble is, there are very few rivers in this country that have enough money to do both. And so a decision has to be made. And in that respect, David, I think it's very often those that shout loudest that win, and the hatchery will always get the most number of votes. I can tell you anyway. And therefore, I think we can legitimately say, by excluding management or longer-term projects, hatcheries do damage stocks.
Thanks, Stephen. We have 2 more minutes, okay? Just 2 more minutes. This gentleman here, and then John. We have to go to round up at that point.
I'm getting the perception here that anglers are becoming the problem. And when really anglers are your answer. Because if the anglers aren't on the river, you don't see your pollutions, you don't see the poaching problems, and you don't see a lot of other things. But I think what we also have to take into account...
Sorry, if you could just hold the mic down a little bit. Sorry, yeah.
I think what we've not taken into account is the amount our cities have grown in the last 100 years, the amount of people using the water, the amount of pollutions coming in from washing machines, things like this. And once you've taken all this into account, then the habitat is going to suffer. And the habitat can only suffer so far. We can only restore that habitat to a certain extent, and it's going to cost millions and millions and millions. So that we are losing stocks, we're losing reds, we're losing fry and everything else. In my view, as an angler, not a scientist, then there comes a time when we have to look at other options. And the restocking is an option, a tool that can be used.
I think you've made my point in relation to what people want. I think as the numbers of anglers increase, as the pressure goes on fisheries, we have to start looking at real serious alternatives, I think. John?
Okay, just briefly, obviously we're coming to the end, and I think we're looking for outputs from 2 days of sitting here. Can I just suggest that in this whole debate, obviously opinions can become very entrenched, and indeed they have done over the years. I don't think definitive and very strongly held beliefs expressed in, certainly on the scientific side, in pure scientific terms, really helps the argument. And to go on from what Paul Knight was saying on what do we actually put out there, I think both sides of this, for want of a better word, need to actually think about that and think, how can you actually have a bit of sympathy for each side of this argument? If you're on the science side, it might be sympathy for the angler, for the guy that does want to catch more salmon, and I vigorously defend those people. As my colleague here has just said, these are the guys bringing money to the river. But also as a river manager, it's my responsibility to talk to my anglers, and it's really part of my job to make them understand what some of the scientists are saying. So please, let's not sort of end these 2 days being back in our camps. Let's think, how can we actually really meaningfully bring this together? And I think it's not through definitive comments and being entrenched.
John, that's exactly what I'm asking. Exactly what I'm saying. It goes right back to what David said to start with. There wasn't anything, there were 5 options, and I think it should go from there. And there should be this very simple decision process, and that hatcheries have got a part to play somewhere. But let's lay it out very simply for people. I'm not saying entrenched views at all. No way.
Okay. I intend to wrap it up. Anyone got one more burning question? Peter, you want to make just a point of clarification? Yeah? Yeah.
If that is what you're looking for, a relatively simple document that takes you through the process of it's really a plug, Ken.
Yeah,
that's what it is. But if that's what you're looking for a really simple document where you look at compliance assessment, you look at evaluation of the problem, development of a management plan, monitoring and evaluation of progress. I think the document that Ted mentioned, the guidelines to stop rebuilding, are a good starting point. They might need some tweaking, but they have the advantage of already being approved internationally, so it would be a good starting point, I think.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's absolutely correct. And as we said, what John Gibb used yesterday, was taken from some of those NASCO documents. So we need to dust them off and put them in that simple context, I think. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a very, very long couple of days. Hopefully you found it productive and useful. I certainly found it fascinating. So John McCartney, from Director with the Locks Agency, John is actually formally going to close the meeting for us. John.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that always on the second day of a conference, you're always keen to get away. Locks Agency is a lead partner with IBIS, the University of Glasgow and Queen's University in Belfast. Have been very proud and pleased to be associated with this event. Locks Agency prides itself on fisheries management based on transparent scientific evidence. And this is the type of event that brings out the science and makes it transparent for everybody. Events of this type, which interface scientists and scientific work with the stakeholders, is, in my opinion, the most appropriate method and way of exchanging ideas. I personally was very, very pleased to see not only our scientists, conservationists, anglers, commercial netsmen, utility companies and fishery managers all in one place discussing this issue, because I think that is the only way forward. Quite often we become separated and our views become polarized. Whoa. Rather than get into long debates at this time, I would like to thank the hotel staff, the speakers and the chairs, and yourselves as the audience for the polite and measured way in which you've made contributions and the enthusiasm in which you've made some of those contributions as well. Obviously, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Salmon Trust, who without this partnership with us wouldn't have been possible. And I would like to thank the organising committee, Ken, Ivor and Paddy, and the IBIS team for their excellent organisation. You know, I spent a disproportionate amount of my time at organised events, and I must say that the IBIS ones, including this one, have been some of the best organised and easiest and fastest moving that I've had. The IBIS team, Andrew, Jennifer, Lindsay and Hannah, have worked tirelessly on this for quite some time, and I think that I'd like to have a round of applause for them if that's possible. Hannah Taylor in particular has put in a very significant personal effort into this, and we've a small token of our appreciation for you, Hannah. Okay, thank you. Well, folks, it only leaves me to formally close the conference and wish you a very, very safe journey home. And hopefully we'll see you again at some point in the near future at some other event. Thank you very much.